Welcome to the Dark Ozarks. We are discussing German folklore and how it has lived on in the Ozarks. So what's so grim in the Ozarks?
We tend to think of the British Isles and the Scots Irish when we talk about folklore here in the Ozarks, but we owe a lot to the Brothers Grimm and many other Germanic influences. Dark fairy tales are alive and well here in the hills.
We will get back to dark folklore, but first we want to invite you to like, follow, and subscribe to Dark Ozarks on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, as well as your favorite podcast platform. We also invite you to become a Dark Ozarks subscriber on Facebook. On the Dark Ozarks Facebook page, click subscribe, have your login information ready, and join Dark Ozarks behind the scenes for only $4.99 per month.
Your $4.99 per month subscription allows you to come with us on paranormal investigations, deep dive research, and topics too controversial for public view. The next 100 subscribers will be entered in a drawing for a free Dark Ozarks t-shirt and an exclusive signed first-round copy of the book Dark Ozarks, The Spooklight. Subscribe today to be entered in the drawing.
And now you can get Dark Ozarks t-shirts for sale at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com.
Mark your calendars for State of the Ozarks Fest 23, Saturday, September 16th, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. in historic downtown Hollister, Missouri. Meet Dark Ozarks producers, Lisa and Josh. Celebrate the traditional Ozarks with craftsmanship, history, and lore. Experience emerging culture through cosplay, goblins, regional cuisine, and fine arts, and medieval combat. And even visit the haunted The Old English Inn. Visit stateoftheozarks.net for more information.
We encourage you to check out Always Buying Books in Joplin, Missouri, in person and online on Facebook and at the website alwaysbuyingbooks.com for all of your reading needs, including a large section on the paranormal, history, and more. Not to mention, the building is haunted. Tell Bob and Elise that we sent you.
We also want to thank Beard Engine Brewing Company in Alva, Missouri. Beard Engine Brewing is the only English-style brewery in Missouri and has been twice named Missouri's best brewery by the Missouri Brewers Association. Great beer and great food in a historical building with a noir past. And yes, their building is also haunted. Tell Nate and Tiff that we sent you.
So, the grim reality of lore in the Ozarks.
Well, the first thing that has to be understood is just how much German settlement took place in Missouri and Arkansas, beginning from a very early stage and then coming in successive waves. But coming back to that early stage, there was a lot of German settlement in the early colonies. There was a lot of German settlement in the inland push of the great Northwest, i.e. Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. There's a lot of German settlement in Tennessee and Kentucky in those early formative decades of the United States. And so not dissimilarly to the Scots Irish. And you see an interesting mirroring that in the early days of colonial settlement and pioneer settlement and inland push to establish the United States before the Louisiana Purchase. You see the Scots Irish, and you see a lot of Germans, a lot of German immigration. Or immigration from peoples with a shared dialect of what later became known as Germany. That would be a better way of putting that. And then something happening in the 1840s. We had the Prussian Wars, which created a huge push. I mean, two things. I mean, we really overlook just how devastated Europe was during this time. We have the perhaps ill-named potato famine, which was complex, to say the least, in terms of how the United Kingdom was dealing with Ireland during that process. There was indeed a potato blight, and people were indeed starving to death, but it was a lot more complex and complicated than that. And at the same time, you have the Prussian Wars on the continent, and the potato famine in Ireland and the Prussian Wars, predominantly in continental Europe, pushed thousands and thousands of essentially Germans and very much the Irish to North America.
Yes. And I think it's important too that we often think of some of these migrations as being from the lower echelons of society and unskilled labor. And when it came to those on the continent coming to North America as a consequence of the Prussian Wars and the fallout there, a lot of those people and a lot of those men were highly skilled, highly educated, seasoned soldiers, and that had a real influence over the next 20, 30 years when they got here, and a lot of them ended up in what now we would call the upper South and in the Midwest, and had a big influence on the Civil War, etc.
It did massive impact. The German immigration into St. Louis cannot be discounted. It was extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. And generally, by and large, the German immigrants arriving predominantly in St. Louis were very pro-union.
They were, and even before we get to the Civil War itself, there is a bit of the macabre and noir side that in that region that we can talk about in Ozarks that centers on immigrants, and in particular German and Irish immigrants, and that would be Professor McDowell in his medical college.
Yes, let's jump in. Where was the medical college located?
Well, it was on Garriott Avenue, and it was the first medical school west of the Mississippi, and ultimately became what is now known as Washington University Medical School, which is one of the best medical schools and research facilities, along with Barnes Hospital, in the country. But Professor Joseph Nash McDowell was from Tennessee, was educated at the University of Transylvania in Tennessee, and was renowned as one of the preeminent surgeons and medical professors of his time. He also had a rather colorful personality.
And cannon.
And cannons and bears. But actually, more people are familiar with him in a roundabout way than no, because he basically is written about in Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. Because the cave in Tom Sawyer, which now is known as Mark Twain Cave in the Hannibal area, was actually owned by Professor McDowell, and at one point housed the remains of his 14-year-old daughter, who had died suddenly, and he was very much in various ways in the reanimation business, but was very grief-stricken and hoped to preserve her body until such time as science could basically bring her back to life. And so she was preserved in a very high-tech, for the time, metal coffin and her body preserved and kept in the cave for conditions to be monitored, etc. Problem was that the local residents got wind of this, and they would go in and, shine torches on the casket and everything, trying to see in the glass window to see her. And eventually he had her body moved, which is another little bit of a macabre story, because he had her, his wife, and another child who had died were buried on one of the Indian mounds in downtown St. Louis. And they were buried there so that he could see them from his office window. But ultimately, they took the mound down, and so they are interred in a cemetery now. But so, and then that's before we get to bears and cannons.
It is. Now, he had a really interesting relationship with the Jesuits, if memory serves.
Yes, he rivalry would be a better term. He had been the chief medical officer at the city hospital, and this is in the 1830s and 40s. And through politics had lost that position, and he blamed the Jesuits for it. And the Jesuits, who then opened a hospital basically just across the street, and ultimately became a part of what is now St. Louis University. Professor McDowell saw that as an affront, so he did things like shoot cannons across the street at them. Additionally, he occasionally had to deal with mobs marching on the medical school,
Yes.
accusing him of being a reanimation man, which at the time was a term for grave robbers who would take recently deceased corpses, and they would sell them to medical schools, and I'm sure he did buy corpses, and that's how medical students studied. But at times there would be such a number of recent burials, in immigrant communities, particularly Germans and Irish, of missing bodies that they would accuse the professor of singling them out, and they would march on the medical school, and he would let loose his pet bear and shoot cannons at the mob. And so, yes, he was definitely very interesting. And then when the war started, he became one of the chief medical officers for the Confederate Army. And the medical school ultimately was taken over by the Union and turned into a prison. And it was a prison for bushwhackers, basically.
Wow.
It is now a parking lot for the headquarters of Purina.
That's sad. And also an indicator that when we do see these random parking lots, it's important not to jump to conclusions that nothing happened there.
Exactly. But this episode is one part of that Germanic story of those immigrants coming in and the strain to assimilate, to not stand out, but yet keep a bit of their heritage too.
And in the case of the grave robbing, keep their loved ones' bodies.
Exactly. Yeah. Professor McDowell actually wrote a story that he credited the ghost of his mother for helping him evade one of the mobs.
Yes. They were breaking into the university, and that she guided him into areas, then down hallways and through locations that they weren't. That the mob
Exactly. Which, from his personality and other things that are written about him, I wouldn't have necessarily taken him to be a spiritualist in any sense. But then on the other hand, during that time period, spiritualists tended to have more of a scientific view of things than the two have in common today.
It is, and certainly just as a quick note on spiritualism, in the 19th century, from New England on, is that before there was such a essentially cultural misappropriation by individuals just looking to make money, there was, for lack of a better word, this is not a precise word, but there was a pure effort within spiritualism to connect the unknown of spiritual possibilities, particularly and specifically after death, with science and with enlightenment, rationality, and thought. So we certainly look at it from a unique hindsight lens of excessive sentimentality, excessive nostalgia, and then definitely clouded by the showmanship and the quote unquote quackery of individuals just saying, "Oh, I can put you in contact with your loved one for $20."
Exactly.
But there's historically within the narrative, there is a very sober and academic element to it, particularly in the comparatively early phases of spiritualism, beginning in the Finger Lakes region of New York.
Agreed.
Well,
And I think that those kind of pressures and tensions, aside from maybe just the general inclination to gravitate towards the federal government army because of the experience in Prussia, the same group ended up being a very large segment of the Union forces in the Civil War in the Trans-Mississippi.
yes, they were. They were. And it is an interesting cultural narrative, the reality that the difficult irony that in many cases, certainly in Missouri, certainly in the early phases of the war, you had Union troops who were German and German speaking, in some cases completely non-English speaking, marching against and opening fire on individuals who had been born and raised in Missouri and were identifying certainly with initially state neutrality and then state partisanship, and then ultimately with the Confederacy. So certainly a lot of room for animosity of the American soldiers who had grown up in Missouri, born in Missouri. In some cases, their parents had been born in Missouri. In some cases, even before statehood, suddenly being, finding themselves in conflict with armed Germans who don't speak English.
Well, and more precisely, then they were referred to as the Dutch. That was the term used for German American soldiers during the Civil War, is the Dutch. And of course, if anyone wondering, this predates the formation of Germany as a country. So, referring to them as the Dutch, because there was a large portion of the Netherlands that spoke German, that was as accurate as anything else in some ways. But it definitely was used during the war as a slur.
Right. And certainly from their perspective, understandably so. I think my conceptual commentary in this regard is it's actually rather encouraging the fact that every generation has to deal with varying aspects of conflict like this, and that you look back and now we regard the German settlement in mid-Missouri with nostalgia and tourism, and wine and beer and cheese and bratwurst and fun festivals and those types of things, beautiful architecture, and that's not to diminish the conflict or diminish the plight, but it is encouraging that to some degree over the generations, human beings do find ways to get along.
Yes, agreed. And to accept their differences. So no, I agree wholeheartedly. And that may be a good jumping off place to talk about Little Germany in Missouri, which is the focal point, of course, is Hermann, Missouri, but that entire region, the Little Rhine, basically.
Yes, and I love Hermann, Missouri. Every time I go there, I'm sad to leave, and I can't wait to get back. But it really, started primarily in 1829. I think that's interesting. So very, very early, Missouri being established as for statehood in 1821, and so only 8 years after that, essentially a German travel log writer, named Gottfried Duden, published, quote unquote, Journal of a Trip to the Western States of North America. That was 1829, and the book was immensely popular in Germany. And he describes the Missouri River between St. Louis and Jefferson City as being like the Rhine, the Rhine Valley. And so by 1834, we're only talking a 5-year difference from the publishing of the book to the point the German settlers began getting off a riverboat, a steamboat, at what is present day Hermann, Missouri.
Yes, and it's interesting because in some ways that those kind of things still happen. It makes me think of people in Europe and Japan, Australia coming over to tour Route 66 now, because of information that gets published or seen on TV, etc., that it becomes a destination and they have an affinity for it that is in some ways more, I don't want to say more devoted or dedicated, but stronger in some senses than it's even our own affinity for it. And it's the same kind of thing that happened with the Little Rhine.
It's what they were able to accomplish in a comparatively short amount of time was extraordinary. By specifically in December of 1837, Hermann was founded with 17 settlers getting off of a steamboat and finding out that the land that they had purchased, of course, there's other German settlement as well, and a lot of German settlement coming into St. Louis. But specifically with Hermann, what they found out was that the rolling fields of grain that they were anticipating planting was not going to be an option because it was their land was mostly vertical. And if you go to Harmon and look at the location, you realize that there are a lot of very steep hills. And when you think about this is, we're coming up on not quite 200 years of land management later, just imagining what it was like, 180 years ago.
Especially when you got off the boat thinking that you're going to plant wheat or oats or barley or some rye or something, and find that. But they were practical and noticed there was a lot of wild grapes, and so they went with it. And of course there was a rich vineyard history in the Rhine.
Yes.
Area anyway, so but I'm sure there was a bit of a panic, and I think one of the settlers, if I remember right, referred to it as a howling wilderness.
Yes. Yes. And 1837, you had 17 settlers attempting to create something. Within 2 years, the population had grown to 450, and Herman became the at the time the dominant steamboat port between St. Louis and Kansas City.
Mm-hmm. It's just amazing when you think about how quickly it grew. It was just exponential, really.
It did. I mean, in 1842, the county seat was moved to Herman. 1847, Michael Poschel opened Herman's first commercial winery, which became known as Stonehill Winery, which is still in business.
Mm-hmm.
Fall of 1848, we're looking at 11 years after those settlers first landed. 1848, they host their first wine fest, and folks come in by steamboat from St. Louis to attend the festival. and then also it gets the railroad comes through there as well, fortunately. Mm-hmm. So even with the potential decline of steamboat traffic, then Herman is still able to continue. What, of course, note that by 1860, approximately 30 steamboats were based in Herman, Missouri, transporting raw goods such as lumber, iron, barrels of wine, beer, and also bringing tourism. And I know we've talked about this before, but the fact that throughout the United States history, all the way back to the 1700s, tourism was an industry.
It was. It just wasn't marketed the same way, really.
And certainly the early development, tourism via steamboats was a real thing. Tourism via rail was a real thing as soon as steamboats and rail became available. And I find that really interesting. We don't think of the Civil War era people taking vacations, but they did. Mm-hmm. And I was particularly reminded of that the last time I was in Biloxi, Mississippi. And of course, the rail goes through there, and there's the naval manufacturing and Air Force Base and everything. But there's some very, very old structures and some very old hotels that date back to before the Civil War. And when the rails were built, the Mississippi Gulf Coast, between Pascagoula and modern day Gulfport, and certainly to Pass Vashon, was a tourism destination for, in particular, folks in New Orleans. And they could get on the train and rapidly transit out there and get a nice hotel and enjoy the ocean, enjoy the Gulf breezes and the food and the tourism. And they were doing that during the war.
Yes. And that went on in Missouri too. I mean, Herman was a good example of that, that we had a combination of, I think, more in the eastern part of the state, those things going on and more uninterrupted. In western Missouri, not so much.
And and I think that pop culture has a lot to do with this, that every time that we see, mid 19th century stories being portrayed on TV or oftentimes in books, certainly on film, it is the wild frontier, it is the war, it is striving, etc., against conflict, and that is all very true, but it doesn't take into account that there were also, thanks to the Industrial Revolution, there were massive thriving metropolitan areas, and even before the Civil War, considerable amounts of wealth being accumulated and a burgeoning middle class that, even despite tragedy and despite conflict, there were individuals going, yes, I do want to take a steamboat, buy its ticket for the steamboat and go to Winefest. I do want to get on the railroad and get a nice hotel in Biloxi that overlooks the Gulf of Mexico, and either be ignorant of the fact or choose not to care about the fact that 11 miles off the coast is Ship Island, and it's a prisoner of war camp by the Union.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's often the case in many hard times, that you have a dichotomy going on. And in the Ozarks, it really was kind of east and west. East, certainly there was disruption, particularly in some areas, but less disruption of daily life than in the Western Ozarks.
And then coming back to Herman, just from a sociocultural standpoint, Civil War, comparatively speaking, did not ravage Herman, Missouri. Was
No.
not, to my knowledge, it was not involved in any conflicts. It was a huge steamboat port, etc. And then the rails, but the temperance movement and prohibition did.
Oh, definitely. And that gets talked about a lot about in terms of Prohibition era gangsters in Chicago and so forth, but it affected places like Herman very much so. And that you had that going on, and then as you got to World War I, there was a lot of anti-German sentiment too, which also affected the area.
It did, and you really can't understand the sociocultural aspects of German settlement in Missouri and Arkansas without taking World War I into account, and certainly the war and the mass and I would say, now we're a long time distant, but I would say that the propaganda fueled intensity of anti-German sentiment during that time was unfortunate, to say the least.
It was, and to be honest, it went both ways. There were a number of German-speaking publications throughout the center of America, particularly, that advocated the German position in the war, and kind of fed fuel to the flames. So it was, both sides were giving and taking there, but and ended up being just unfortunate all the way around. And it did have a brief chilling effect, I think, on German communities and German culture.
It really
Um,
did. And there are a number of accounts of German families changing their names,
yeah,
Americanizing their names, and in an effort to become, not become a target.
yes, and certainly understand that, and different groups have done that throughout time in America, not just the Germans, but
Oh yeah.
and certainly can understand that pressure, not wanting to deal with that, and that time period and that push perhaps is part of why a number of anthropologists and so forth would write about how, gee, the Germans didn't seem to leave much imprint on the Ozarks generally.
And I would argue very strongly that is true. That certainly German immigration that had been going on and on for a very long period of time. Pre United States, German families in the colonial era, moving forward to the mass German immigration in the 1840s to Middle America, had that kind of, that there was, over time, that there was a lot of adaptation, that there was a lot of cultural homogenization and becoming American, quote unquote. But the anti-war sentiment, the intense anti-war or anti-German sentiment during World War One, really intensified the obvious need to, or push, and desire to homogenize culture, certainly from a surface standpoint. And
Agreed.
it created what, honestly, I would propose is a very unique cultural occurrence, if anyone would want to study it, because certainly as long as the German cultural groups had been in the United States, they were in a good position to quote unquote homogenize.
Mm-hmm.
They'd been here long enough. It wasn't overnight. It wasn't first generation in many cases. It was, plenty of time to get their feet under them in terms of what does it mean to be American? What does American culture look like in this just very late Edwardian age in Middle America? And then intense propaganda and anti-German sentiment, which, as you noted, was not entirely unwarranted, because they were still German cultural societies with all German newspapers and all German-speaking clubs, etc. And the fear that was a national security risk with the impending war, and then with the war. So there's certainly two aspects. Of course, we are also looking at something that hasn't changed much: the robust, frantic quality of American journalism coming out of the Spanish-American War was certainly alive and well in 1914, and looking for interesting ways to sell newspapers. And every good conflict needs a good villain. So there's a lot of moving parts. But what we really see, and I find this interesting because I have German ancestry as well, what we really see is, from an anthropological standpoint, something that's really fascinating. We see large swaths of this population becoming overtly American, overtly homogenized, deliberately so, not necessarily even organically. I think you could argue that between 1840 and 1910, the homogenization process had happened largely organically. And then suddenly it was conscious and decisive that we are going to be overtly American, and we are going to be utterly not German in terms of our cultural structure. And then to look at from a historical and a cultural standpoint, to look at the impact of prohibition.
Yeah.
Immediately on the heels of this, we have 4 years of intense anti-German sentiment with this First World War, and then we have prohibition, and nothing scarcely is more continental European than beer and wine. And suddenly
particularly German.
yeah, exactly. And suddenly that gets stripped away. And so, and we will get into folklore, guys, and dark, creepy folklore, but I'm on a roll about my German past, and also the fact that I love Hermann, Missouri. But you have this situation that there's not just I would argue not a veneer of Americanism, but a thick layer of Americanism that is created and perpetuated in the generation between World War I and World War II. And what remains, what is so interesting, because that is not a veneer. I would call it a thick layer. It's, if you're using a cake analogy, it's not the icing on top of the cake. It is like if there's a double layer cake, it's the entire first layer is all American. And the generation who were born, as children in the First World War and so on, growing up suddenly overtly, both in urban centers as well as rural Missouri and Arkansas, growing up with this overt Americanism. And of course, many of those young men, then with German last names, there was no question of their Americanism or their loyalty when they went to fight in Europe.
In World War II. No, granted.
II.
And often they were viewed as an asset. Those that did retain some of their German culture and language became even more valuable in World War II.
Yes.
I had it reminds me, I had a teacher in fifth grade that Mr. Martins was his name. And his family was German, and he grew up speaking German and English. And during World War II, went to work for the Office of the OSO, which was in the intelligence service, and ultimately worked as a double spy in Germany in World War II. And every year they would do in our grade school, they would do a section on World War II, and they would highlight this, and they'd highlight his participation. And he had more medals and commendations and photos receiving awards from FDR and Truman than you could shake a stick at. And it always kind of saddened me that the importance, of that in that kind of role was lost on most of the people, around me. And so it was and I tell that story because it's kind of that tightrope between being homogenized and retaining that culture. And if they had completely been homogenized, it would have been to the detriment of America, actually, in World War II.
It would have been. And the thing that I think is sad is that something that has happened anthropologically is that, as has been noted in a number of academic papers, the German lore and the German experience is difficult to observe, and so much so that it becomes questioned as to whether or not it even exists. The idea that the Americanization was so complete that the culture just doesn't exist. And I would argue that's not the case. I would argue that we're not understanding how to look.
I agree, and I think that's even more of an issue in the Arkansas Ozarks than in Missouri, because in Missouri we have places like Herman and Freistadt, etc., that remind us pretty clearly. Yes, we had a strong German contingent of settlement, but in Arkansas there were a large number of German settlers, but there isn't as much of that remaining effect on place names and industry that scream out German. And yeah,
the thing that oftentimes gets missed and what you look for, and of course there's a great centers of German culture in the eastern Missouri Ozarks, Marble Hill, Piedmont, through those counties. And what is so interesting to look for, the first thing that you look for are Catholic churches.
mm-hmm.
And it's very fascinating. You get over here into Southwest Missouri, Stone and Taney County, the Catholic churches are in cities or in town, and they're vastly outnumbered by Church of Christ and Baptists and Pentecostal churches, and that's one of the
even by the Methodists and Presbyterians too.
Yes. And so you look at those points of comparison, and you look for, and to me, what you look for is a large rural Catholic church with a big roofed outdoor picnic seating area.
Yes.
And that seems silly, that seems simple, but but it's that, to me, that is a dominant cue of retained German culture. And the idea that, and the other is the church cookbook.
The church cookbook, the barns,
German
the
flour.
And you when you see them, it's like at some point there were German settlers there.
Yes, and in many cases, with the exception of the emptying of rural America, with that as an exception, oftentimes those German settlers, German settlement families in certain situations are still there, and are perpetuating. They are still having the potlucks at church. They are still gathering in those ways. And to me, it is especially fascinating because this it's not certainly it's not German culture from Prussia in 1840, but it is also, and it's very much Ozarks hill country culture, but it is Ozarks culture that doesn't fit the hillbilly pastiche that is perpetuated by 100 years of tourism in Southwest Missouri and Northwest Arkansas.
Very true. Very true. And on that note, that might be a good segue into culture, and particularly lore, from the Germanic continent.
From the Germanic. Let's I want to talk about buttery sprites.
I know you do.
And it's a good place to jump into, because I think I encountered one in the wine cellars at Stonehill, at Herman.
Mm-hmm.
And it, again, I can't stress enough how, if you've not been to Herman, Missouri, you should go. It is so beautiful and such a neat place to spend time in. But it was a comparatively early experience for me after we had begun Dark Ozarks.
That's true. That is true. Because I remember when that happened and you telling me.
I think I texted you as it was,
Mhm.
as I was parenting it. But it's sort of a ghost story. I find it really fascinating to parse out, because I felt strangely, and in a positive way, strangely drawn to the wine cellar. I kind of just walked in, and knowing me, this is a little unusual because I passed up all of the cases of food that you walk by, and I went downstairs, and I get downstairs, and it felt very profound. It felt that there was a presence there, that there was a profundity to the space, an oldness to the space, and weirdly enough, even an oldness to the space that predated the space. That's all I can really explain on that. Certainly, the existence of a presence implies a haunting, and
Or can, yeah.
that's the implication. And I'm not arguing that there might not also be hauntings, but I think what I encountered was not a haunting. It is a very light space, but it was interesting because I felt extremely drawn into it in an unusual way. And then as I'm looking around, I'm just going, there's something here. I can't put my finger on it, but there's something here. I need to get my conscious mind out of the way to be able to formulate some structure here. And then I wander over, after all of that, I wander over, and there's a plaque on the wall that says, oh, by the way, the wine cellar is haunted. And and we think that it might be so-and-so who passed away, fill in the blanks. His spirit may be there, but the implication is that things move around, and there's a presence that makes itself known within the wine cellar. And then it was, hats off to Scary Fairy Godmother on YouTube, that several months later I was listening, and the YouTube channel covered a variety of phenomena. And for people who are not familiar with the channel, sometimes there are fiction pieces related to fairies that are read on the channel for entertainment purposes. And then sometimes what is submitted is gathered lore. And then sometimes what is submitted is individuals' personal experiences. So you get all three. Mm-hmm. And in this particular case, it was gathered lore speaking about buttery sprites. And buttery sprites have a fae or fairy tale or fairy quality, and it is essentially poltergeist activity that is taking place in food cellars, wine cellars, areas that have had a lot of this traffic. And the idea is that that there is an association, and this goes back to Old English lore, but that there is an association with some sort of fae attraction to, and again, it sounds like a trope, but a fae attraction with butter and cream and sugar and wine and beer and bread and all the good things, and that the situations being recorded in which poltergeist like activity, things being moved, footsteps, voices, having your clothing pulled upon, perhaps your hair pulled, and then also an aspect of almost a conjure protection, that the sprites are very protective of the space. And if someone starts, for example, might attempt vandalism, that they could push back. All of those
Right.
things. And the term comes from these large constructed cellars, of course, pre refrigeration. These large constructed cellars to contain a lot of food, or a lot of wine, a lot of cheese, and keep all of these things. Also was where you put the butter and the cream, and they were called butteries. And so this type of activity developing within the space, they were referred to as buttery sprites. I suspect, and it's sufficient only, that the old, very old wine cellars at Stonehill have a buttery sprite.
And I like that notion, and I think it's very possible. And sort of a sprite is sort of the English version, and on the continent, the Germanic lands, they typically were referred to more as goblins or hobgoblins. But we're talking about the same type of entity or behavior. And if, they could remain invisible, sometimes they would almost appear as animals, or even as a fire or a candle. If they did appear as, a person, they usually were small, like children. Usually take on the appearance of peasants or sailors or miners along that line. And often centered around hearth, and the butteries would go along with that. And but then on the continent, there was a resistance of holding on to pre-Christian pagan beliefs and veneration of the hearth and home, and so it's all tied up into those notions. So, if I was going to, if I was some sort of being like that, and I was going to haunt a place, some place with lots of butter and cream and maybe ale, you can do a lot worse than that.
You can do much worse than that. And there's well, just from a folkloric standpoint and from a historical standpoint, there's a lot. You've got the for people who might be familiar with it, kobolds. It's an overarching idea, and there's,
which goes back to the Greek, if I remember, doesn't it?
I believe so. And you're looking at a really unique manifestation that is, again, I don't think that there's any part of the populated world in terms of primitive, old experiences that don't have some lore associated with this type of manifestation.
Mm-hmm.
The little people and the Iwa for around here is the Quapaw and the Cherokee. You see that. You see very similar examples in Mayan and Aztec lore. You see this in Asian lore. You see it in African lore. You see it in European lore. So the idea that somehow all of humanity just has somehow managed to just spontaneously dream this experience up with nothing to go on is a bit of a stretch. I think that is a greater level of illogic than the idea that these things are real.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
And interestingly enough, and of course I conveniently brought along my Grimm's fairy tales book, and something that really is perhaps a disservice. We associate the term fairy tale with children's stories, and we associate children's stories with things that just get made up, and we associate it with juvenile literature. We associate it with silly stories, and it is also interesting. I'm gonna put on my anti-sexism hat for a moment. They there is a strong, during the Industrial Revolution, there's a really strong push to say, I mean, even the term old wives' tales, the idea that if children or elderly women in society are talking about these things, then you dismiss them.
Mm-hmm. True.
And of course we know that children in particular can oftentimes see and experience things that adults can't, in terms of audio and visual wavelength.
True.
And there's a great body of academic literature, etc., that looks at the cultural discounting of women, particularly older women, in terms of the modernization of industrialized society. And to tie this back to the Ozarks, you look at the traditionally very important role that granny women played,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to what happened during the 20th century.
That's true, because and older women, or in the trinity of the feminine, the hag, the crone, represents wisdom, experience, and with modernization, that idea became sort of threatening to changing society. And
it did.
And in part and it also paralleled over hundreds of years the process of vilification of outsiders, particularly outsider women, that led to witch trials, etc. So you had that parallel going there. But ironically, we've kind of come full circle, and the anthropologists are recognizing that older women actually were very instrumental for society to develop initially and to continue to modernize, because they helped the family unit care for the children so that the parents could be more industrious, which led to industrialization over time.
It did. And as is often the case, particularly on the what I would consider to be the superficial layers of populist propaganda,
Mm-hmm.
that you see the pendulum swinging heavily in one extreme and then the other extreme and then the other extreme, and that doesn't really ever seem to stop, unfortunately. But underneath that, where the proverbial rubber meets the road, you consistently have reality, the reality that and the reality is harder to manipulate. The reality it is slower to change, and that's where you see, particularly, and it's something that has helped the Ozarks slowly stand out, although we are obviously under threat from cultural homogenization, and have been for decades. The fact that change is slower here, and so the very traditional and important role of granny women that in previous iterations of Western civilization was a lot greater, in various forms, continued longer into the Ozarks, even into common memory. And it is an incredible representation of the Morrigan, the the triune goddess figure,
Mhm.
maiden, mother, crone, and the idea that every one of those goddess manifestations have their own positives and negatives,
Mhm.
and that's and I would also argue pop culture and marketing standpoint, certainly in the 20 heavily in the 20th century is and we can blame Snow White, the Disney film. Just for the record, I do love the Disney film, but we in the 20th century we see very little proliferation of the positive aspects of the crone goddess.
Mhm.
It's
That's
all
true.
negative. It's all negative. And what goes along with that is an extraordinary industrial push of fear of aging.
Mhm.
And I think that's been a horrible blight on American culture, particularly as with the population shifts that occurred in consequence of the Second World War and the mass industrialization that really capped off and defined American culture in the 20th century. You see this huge push to the suburbs, and along with that is a billion-dollar industry on how to fake being young.
True. True. But this also makes me think of the fact that when you're looking at folklore from Germanic cultures, there is a bit of a split from some of the motifs that you see a lot in British Isle folklore, that it is, before we ever get to the Brothers Grimm, just in general, it focuses more on the average person, whereas so many of the Isles lore focuses around either royalty, say King Arthur, etc., or someone with supernatural power, almost the comic book hero like Merlin or someone. Whereas lore in the Germanic areas, you have the heroes often are the underdog. They're the peasants or children, and the royalty often is the foil, is the villain.
That's a really good point. And there's a number of to me, there's a number of really interesting aspects. The folklore, as opposed to mythology, folklore has, certainly within continental Europe and in the face of industrial revolution, has been the space in which the old beliefs have been able to remain in some
Mhm.
way still alive. And first of all, I think that's unbelievably beautiful. I think that there is an extraordinary testament to the reality of these beliefs and at times their manifestation, based on the fact that they've continued, that they have
Mhm.
always continued. And sometimes they manifest in very undeniable ways. We talk about kobolds, and we talk about kobolds, we talk about sprites, we talk about poltergeist, we talk about spectral hounds, and so on and so forth. My in a very modern home, in a very modern workshop in the 1970s. My grandpa saw little boot prints through his sawdust,
Oh,
little
neat.
boot prints through his sawdust. As he described it, little hobnail boots. Somebody was walking through his wood shop, and then there was in approximately the same space and time there was some coffee that was spilled on the counter overnight, and there was little hobnailed boot prints walking through the coffee grounds on the counter. Grandpa and Grandma both saw them. We have one of our unbelievably weirdly long-lived dogs who then disappears, and then her voice shows up in the cupboards.
Mhm.
These things.
Centered around the hearth, basically.
Centered around the kitchen. And when these things happen, they become part of the familial lore, and it's not going to be in the newspaper. It's not going to be in a book. It's not going to be in any of those things. And it's nothing. It's a magical moment. It gets passed down from person to person, and it just is. And so there's an extraordinary, I hesitate to use the term peasantry quality to it, but there's just a close association with real people, with working people, not the aristocracy, but just the everyday working people, knowing that there's more around them than meets the eye.
And to me, I think it's fascinating that it's that lore that ends up taking on such a noir quality.
It does.
And whereas sort of the fantastical, the sort of, as we said, the Isles lore that is all about supernatural beings like Merlin and these
Arthur.
glamorous people, sort of the comic book over the top blockbuster movie kind of characters, really are not nearly as gritty or in some ways as powerful or magical as they are on the continent.
It is one of those things that there is an everyday aspect to it. It definitely was introduced into the United States by way of, I would say, predominantly German and Scots and English, and to some degree Irish, although the Irish have such a defined lore, particularly in regards to Fae, that the Irish Fae really have a compendium of their own. There's certainly crossover and similarity, but the sort of continental Europe, along with Anglo-Saxon, along with Scots, coming across. But interestingly, and I talked about this a little bit last time, but the Etruscan beliefs of hearth and fae definitely are suggestive of I again hesitate to paint with a broad brush, but we're looking at a strong similarities throughout continental Europe, and then likely spreading into the British Isles, most likely, but not exclusively, by way of Anglo-Saxon invasion. The Angles and the Saxons. And it's reasonable to say, I believe, that certainly the mystique, coming back, as you mentioned, the heightened Arthurian legend magic being the mists and majesty of Avalon, and I think to a large degree we see a heavy aristocratic French influence in terms of
Mhm.
perpetuating that. Certainly, they were drawing from a Welsh base, not dissimilar to the Mabinogian, but I think that an argument could be made that we're really looking at French aristocratic propaganda in terms of developing the Arthurian legends. We see
Well,
this,
to more Arthur, it was French.
and what you're looking at is heightened literature during the Plantagenets. You're looking at a really interesting situation of essentially with the several hundred years in which there were two Englands,
Hmm.
um, following following the Battle of Hastings and the William the Conqueror's big win, at which point the Norman French become the English aristocracy, and of course
Hmm.
begin progressively building uh, incredibly, exquisitely beautiful, imposing, and unbelievably hated fortresses across England. And this, again, I mean, we've talked about these weird language issues. You have a situation in which at the height, the Plantagenet kingdom, which really was more of an empire, or the Angevin Empire, stretching from Hadrian's Wall to the Pyrenees, and the king of England is sitting on a throne in France,
Yes.
and you have a situation, and of course this is how one of the reasons that modern English is so confusing is that it is a hybridization. I do prefer the term hybridization to mutation of Anglo-Saxon dialects, Old English, i.e. Beowulf, and Norman Old French, and then mixing well and redistilling via Shakespeare and King James. So that was a really short version, but you had the situation was the folks in charge, the aristocracy in charge of England, weren't English. My
Hmm.
my interesting point of comparison is thin and tenuous at best, but you also had Union armies in Missouri who were tenuously American and extremely Prussian.
Exactly. And ironically, for modern audiences, watching whether it's TV dramas or movies, and particularly with the plethora of comic book universe movies in the last 10, 15 years, um, as well as epics such as Star Wars, etc., there's a lot more in common with that story, with our epic storytelling in modern America, with German storytelling actually than that of the Isles in a lot of ways, because the idea that all of these concepts that Joseph Campbell put together and packaged for modern writers for the hero's journey, etc. These are motifs that come straight out of Germanic lore, not English or Irish or Scottish or Welsh lore.
I think that's just an extraordinary point. And Star Wars could not have existed without Carl Jung and Goethe.
Very true. Very true. And literally Joseph Campbell, because George Lucas used Joseph Campbell's hero's journey to write it.
Yes.
But you see that motif over and over. And it is the average man going on that quest with some sort of guide, mentor, and going back to lore, that could be, Cinderella and the fairy godmother, it's godmother, etc. And magic tends to be based around items, which I find interesting, versus magicians with magical power. You have the mirror in Snow White. You have the godmother's wand, etc.
The magic beans.
The beans, all of these things, going through, where magic is in innate objects versus being a power within.
The spinning wheel.
Yes, that's a good one.
The spinning wheel was a huge one. And an interesting read. I want to interject this rather quickly, but an interesting read on this. Something that does stand out in terms of, well, one, when the brothers Grimm were collecting their fairy tales, they were doing it as a serious and adult anthropological study.
Yes.
That's
Vance Randolph.
Yes, 100%. And I'm going to pull out my Ozark ghost stories here and get it primed and ready here, ready to fire. But there's a very interesting thing that I think gets misused or deliberately discarded at our own peril because we're not understanding the code. I'm going to reference, interestingly enough, the New York Times bestseller Iron John by Robert Bly, who makes a really compelling case that the Grimm's fairy tale collected anthropological story, I'm just going to refer to it as a collected anthropological story instead of a fairy tale, is a very complex and a very complex societal code for a level of holistic intelligence for, in this case, boys on the cusp and transitionhood into becoming men. And so that is a powerful, almost shamanistic story, and incredibly powerful because it can speak when it's being told properly by the shaman, by the leader of the holistic intelligence. It can speak into a boy's soul and empower him to become a man. It can show him the journey. It is verbally a shamanistic tapestry. And the idea that all of the characters within the book, whom are mostly fantastical, all have key roles to play within the boy's subconscious.
Right.
And so it is coming out of the subconscious, it is coming out of the dream state. And then within the conscious, it is telling a story that speaks back into the subconscious to contextualize and to help the conscious mind and the ego, in some cases submit, and in some cases press forward and contextualize and enrich the experience of what is, quite frankly, a really difficult process of a boy becoming a man. Now, what is an interesting take on this is that Iron John is one of the rare stories that speaks into the male experience. The majority of the anthropologically collected stories are speaking into the female experience because the protagonist is female. And so
That's true.
the argument, which I think really goes in the face of our more superficial understanding of these societies and these cultures, and the argument is that this is a drawing from the subconscious out into the conscious, a retelling in a fantastical way that also is memorable, so it can be shared from generation to generation, and it is allowed to be for a young a girl transitioning into womanhood, so that all the characters within the story are elements of the girl's subconscious.
Mhm.
And so that's why in various aspects you see positives and negatives. You see maiden mother crone. You see both positive aspects of the female subconscious. You see negative aspects of the female subconscious, and that what I think is an interesting final blow against the attempt to discard these stories as being simplistic is that the once you begin to read the story, that every character, including the prince at the end, that prince is not a prince. That prince is a forward moving hero force within the girl's subconscious.
Mhm.
And the idea that this is actually, every aspect of this story is actually about not only a girl growing into adulthood, into womanhood, but it is also about a girl going through this arduous journey to find herself and to become empowered and to make her own decisions.
Which is something that ironically was dismissed in post-Enlightenment times.
Yes, when we were supposed to be at our most enlightened, that's the part that gets thrown away. And I'm really going to go out on a limb here, because I really don't know what I'm talking about at this point. The earlier part, I think I do. This part, I don't think I know what I'm talking about, but I'm going to go out on a limb as a concept. And you look at the overt marketing momentum of the Disney princess beginning in 1937 to the present. And although, for the record, I think since Disney bought Fox, we could argue that Ripley from Alien is now a Disney princess.
Let's not do that to Ripley.
Okay, that's fair.
Ripley's too good for that. I might get hate mail for that.
We might get shot. But by Ripley. But
yeah, that's true.
Here is my wild tangential conjecture, which is that the subconscious momentum, or the subconscious attraction that did occur, because obviously there are a lot of people that Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, Cinderella in particular, that those films resonated with them as children in very profound ways.
Mm-hmm.
And although the retelling of those stories are pretty heavy-handed compared to the what was original, there are strong elemental motifs that have remained.
Mm-hmm.
My question, my idea, is that those motifs subconsciously speak. The idea that the ancient shamanistic motifs that are built into the story, even after being repackaged over and over and over again, still have the potency to speak into individual subconscious, even when they don't realize what it's saying. In some cases, even when the makers, the creators of the new adaptation, are not necessarily realizing what they're saying.
Perhaps I'm probably not a good one to speak to that, because I thought they were rubbish even as a child.
And that's fair.
I'm much more a fan of the original Grimm stories, and I'm not saying, and I'm not talking about Grimm's fairy tales that you buy at Barnes and Noble.
The one in which Snow White's mother wants her heart, lungs, and liver, and attempts to kill Snow White with an overly tight corset, a poisoned comb, and a poisoned apple, and ultimately the queen is sentenced to death by dancing in a pair of red-hot iron shoes.
Yes, or the wicked stepsisters of Cinderella basically cut their own feet off to fit in the shoes. Yes,
I remember that, and the dripping blood is what gives them away as the fake Cinderellas,
mm-hmm.
and that the magic doves arrive at the end to peck their eyes out.
Yes, Alfred Hitchcock would have been proud.
And Odin.
And Odin, yes. Which, yes, I do think that was a direct allusion there in the original. But yeah, so, but in all seriousness, yes, I do think that there is, even if it's a subconscious level, the original oral traditions and perhaps shamanistic bent to it calls, even if people aren't sure how to answer.
I think that's a powerful
and perhaps that is itself why the Disney reiterations never rang true or interesting to me, is that to me they were very flat and very uninteresting, and maybe that is the reason, is that there was something they were telling me there was supposed to be more,
that there should have been more.
Yeah.
And jumping over back specifically to the Ozarks, it's a now out of print book. If you're interested in Ozarks storytelling, I highly recommend finding an out of print book. It is Ozark Ghost Stories by Richard and Judy Dockery Young, published by August House. This book I purchased in 2004, and it was originally published in 1995, and it is dedicated to Vance Randolph and Miss Mary Celestia Parler, former professors at the University of Fayetteville. And so it is an excellent book. What I really love about it as a folkloric book is it has footnotes. And specifically every story in the book is has a reference point in terms of where the story was collected, and then notations on its cultural provenance.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also a glossary, including werecats.
You have to have werecats.
They had me at werecats, but it's a very to me it's fascinating because it's a great, it can function as a great juvenile fiction, young adult, just pick it up and read it. It's super easy to read, but it also functions as an academic piece.
Yes,
because of its references to provenance and tying Germanic folklore directly into, back to the Ozarks. I think that there's a couple that really stand out, and there in this particular case, stories 4, 5, and 6, which are respectively referred to as Pennywinkle, Pennywinkle, the Blood Red Cedar, and Blood in the Root Cellar, are all the Pennywinkle, Pennywinkle is an Ozark variant of Grimm's The Juniper Tree. Blood Red Cedar is another Ozark variant of Grimm's The Juniper Tree. And Blood in the Root Cellar is an allegory for the onset of menstruation as much as it is a horror story.
A la Carrie.
Yes, very, very much so. And so you see you see all three of those, and I think that it's really, really fascinating in terms of the structural depth that we see in that. And then additionally, stories 1 and 2, which is Old Rawhead, and then Rawhead and Bloody Bones. Old Rawhead is, quote, the most common scary story in the Ozarks and is regarded by many Ozarkers as the definitive Ozarks ghost story. And then Rawhead and Bloody Bones is also known among African-American storytellers as Little John number 8. This variant is also told alongside the traditional Ozark variant. And so we see those existing as well.
I think you can make some parallels. Although Rawhead and Bloody Bones typically is traced to English lore and tales, it is very reminiscent of Germanic tales like the Woodcutter and even Hansel and Gretel and Little Red Riding Hood. And it is rather dark for most, in comparison to most other English tales like that, which I've always wondered that if there was a connection somewhere else, because although it's traditionally viewed as English, it feels a bit different.
And it genuinely may be. You also look, of course, it's going back a long ways, but you look at the Anglo-Saxon influence in literature and English folklore. There's definitely, it's a possibility, and as well as later Germanic influences in England, of which there were many.
Right. And we might just do a little synopsis of the story, so for anyone that's not familiar with it.
This is, I think, the simplest way to do this, if it's okay with you, is for me to just read Old Rawhead, the first story, because it's short.
That's fine.
And again, this is from Ozark Ghost Stories by Richard and Judy Dockery Young. Deep in the Ozarks, folks have always known that there were conjuring women who knew the use of roots and herbs for medicines and the use of remedies and spells. But there were witches too, bad witches that had to be avoided or laid low with good witchcraft when there was bad witchcraft afoot. One old woman was a conjurer, but she wasn't such a bad type. She often used her spells and remedies for good. She had a familiar spirit, the ghost of a dead witch man, that came to her in the body of an old wild razorback hog, and he helped her with her spells. One October, at Halloween, the folks in the valley were holding an early hog scalding. Every October, the hill people would slaughter hogs and put up the meat into the smokehouse for the long winter. When the winds blew cold and the frost comes and the leaves turn, it's hog scalding time. Men gather from miles around and drive their hogs into rail fence pens. The animals are slaughtered and the carcasses scalded enough to get the bristle hair off. Then the butchering begins. By sundown, the meat is all packed in burlap sacks to go home, and the raw skinned hogs' heads and the bloody bones are all that are left out from those burlap sacks of meat. One old lazy hillbilly stole hogs from his neighbors at hog scalding time, and one year he must have rounded up that conjuring woman's familiar too. After the butchering that day, he rode away with a bag of meat and a skinned hog head in the back of his wagon. But the wagon wheel hit a bump, and out onto the dark road rolled the old raw head. "Bloody bones," said the old raw head, "get up and dance." And the bloody bones, back at the butchering pen, jumped up and danced around and pulled themselves together again and came and got the head. Old Rawhead ran into the woods and went to all the critters and borrowed things to wear. He borrowed the panther's fangs, he borrowed the bear's claws, he borrowed the raccoon's tail, and he went to the house of the lazy hillbilly who stole the hogs. The old man and the old woman were in bed when they heard a scrabbling, clattering sound, and sparks jumped off in the coals in the fireplace. The old man got up to see what was the matter. He looked and looked and looked and couldn't find the intruder, and then he looked up the chimney. "Land of Goshen," said the old man. "What have you got those big old eyes for?" "To see your grave," said a deep, hollow voice up the chimney, and the old man ran away. A minute later, he came back and looked up the chimney again. "Land of Goshen," said the old man. "What have you got those great big claws for?" "To dig your grave," said the deep, dark voice. The old man ran away again, but a few minutes later, he came back and looked up the chimney again. "Land of Goshen," said the old man. "What have you got that big bushy tail for?" "To sweep your grave," said the rumbling, rolling voice. The old man ran and hid under the bed, and from there he said, "Land of Goshen, what do you got those long, sharp teeth for?" "To eat you up." At that, old Rawhead came down the chimney and grabbed the lazy thief and ran out the front door with him. You could hear the old man holler and screaming way off in the woods. The next morning, a party of men set out to find him. Old Rawhead had stolen the lazy hillbilly's horse, and they tracked the horse to Hogscald Holler. There, they found a fresh pile of unnatural large bloody bones, but no head at all. And at night, in the full of the moon, old Rawhead rides the stolen horse through the hills and hollers of the Ozarks and holds his old skinned raw head in his hand high up against the moon.
And if that doesn't have overtones of Little Red Riding Hood, etc., I don't know what does.
There are many iterations of this story. We're only sharing one iteration.
Yeah.
I've collected a separate iteration. You are very familiar with a third iteration. I think I like yours better. But no matter regardless, there are always core similarities between the stories.
Yes. But you could almost envision the wolf and Little Red Riding Hood in that exchange, and it is definitely one of my favorite tales out of the Ozarks, and I just have to think that it has as much Germanic influence as English.
I think it has to, realistically, if as much, if not more. And traceability wise, I suspect if you were to trace it, it does seem to be centered from Northwest Arkansas. And I suspect you're going to find, if you could, this is just conjecture on my part, but I believe that if you could trace the origin, specific location of the story's origin, which may or may not be associated with Hogscald Holler.
Right.
But I think that if you could actually know, I suspect what you would find is a strong mountain Germanic settlement.
Very, very possible. And one to keep in mind when you think about the makeup of the Ozark.
Yes.
That might be a good place to wind up tonight.
Sounds good.
We want to remind you not to forget to check out upcoming events and merchandise at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com. Thank you again to Always Buying Books and Beard Engine Brewing Company, as well as State of the Ozarks Fest 23 for bringing the Dark Ozarks to everyone.
On the next episode, we're going to be discussing Dark Tales of the Riverlands here in the Ozarks. Catch the Dark Ozarks podcast on Branson Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or about any other podcast platform. Thank you, everyone. And remember, there are no easy answers in the Dark Ozarks.